but otherwise, okay. So please open your cameras so that we can see each other. It would be good. Okay. So hello everyone. It's nice to see everyone again. So what I would like to talk about in Parashat Bo is a certain angle concerning Moshe Rabbeinu, which we generally don't view Moshe this way. We don't view the interaction between Moshe and Paro in the way which I'm going to describe.
What are you talking about?
What? Hello? Everyone else, please mute themselves. Okay. So in general, I think the picture we get of Moshe Rabbeinu in relationship to Paro is maybe it's biased or colored by like the 10 Commandments and Charlton Heston, even unconsciously, where Moshe comes as a very powerful character who's more powerful than Paro, and Paro eventually buckles under to Moshe, and Moshe comes with a tremendous amount of self-confidence, with God behind him and Aaron next to him, and Shalach et Ami, and he goes and he attacks Paro along at the Or. So we get a picture of a very self-confident Moshe Rabbeinu. And the picture that gets painted by the Zohar, as we'll see in a few minutes, is a very different picture. But before I get into that, I want to introduce how I'm talking about this. And that is as follows. There's a midrash, which in Bereshit Rabbah, which I've quoted many times, and some of you probably heard the midrash. The midrash says as follows. It's the first source. Does everybody have the sources? Yeah?
Can you share your screen, please, with the source?
Okay, I'll share the screen. Just one moment. Let's see.
The source sheet is on the email, so everybody should have it.
Right. Okay, but here I'm sharing my screen. Okay. So we have as follows. In Bereshit Rabbah, okay, I'm a Rabbi Simon. Chamesh pa'amim k'tiv kan ora. Now you're going to wonder what this has to do with Parashat Bo, so I just need a little bit of patience, okay? It says in Maaseh Bereshit, in the story of creation, it mentions light 5 times. Keneged chamisha chumshei Torah, parallel to the 5 books of the Torah. Vayomer Elohim yehi or, keneged Sefer Bereshit, shebo nitasek HaKadosh Baruch Hu uvara et olamo. So yehi or, there's no light yet. It's just the command that there should be light. So sort of setting the stage, and that's Sefer Bereshit, shebo nitasek HaKadosh Baruch Hu uvara et olamo. Everything was like being prepared. And then it says vayehi or, keneged Sefer ve'ela Shmot. So Sefer Shmot is the coming into fruition of that which was set up in Sefer Bereshit. So in a sense, Sefer Bereshit is a foreshadowing of Sefer Shmot. Okay, that's the point that I want to make here. But I'll just read the rest of the midrash. You should see it. Vayar Elohim et ha'or kitov. That's the 3rd time. Keneged Sefer Vayikra. Shumalei halachot rabot, right? Because there's many halachot, so that's the tov, and that's Sefer Vayikra. Vayavdel Elohim bein ha'or uvein ha'choshech is the 4th time. Keneged Sefer Bamidbar shumavdil bein Yosei Mitzrayim leva'ei haaretz. Right, the book of Bamidbar is split into 2. Between the first part of the book is leaving Egypt, and the second part of the book is entering Eretz Yisrael. There's preparation for entering Eretz Yisrael. So that's by Yavdel ben Ha'or ben Ha'choshech. And by Kra Elohim la'or yom keneged Sefer Mishneh Torah shu malei halachot rabot. Right, and the 5th time it says or is parallel to Sefer Devarim, which is a recapitulation of the halachot It's full of halachot. So it's l'kara or yom. It's a translation of the or into human terms. I'm not going to get into that right now. But what concerns me here particularly is the relationship between Sefer Bereshit and Sefer Shmot, where Sefer Bereshit is Yehi Or, which means the original conception of what the light is or what the revelation is in God's plan. So that's his command, Yehi Or, but there is no Or yet. The Or of the command of Yehi Or comes into fruition in Sefer Shmot, where it says Vayehi Or. So the Or that God commands in Sefer Bereshit is expressed, becomes Or, actually, in Sefer Shmot. Okay, do you see that? Yeah? Now, what's very important about this midrash is that normally we might view the stories of the Torah beginning in Sefer Bereshit and ending in the end of Sefer Devarim as a linear story. And what I mean by that is that one thing, obviously the story parts and not the halacha parts, right? That there's a narrative which begins in the beginning, goes through the middle, and ends in the end. It's like there's a timeline. And a line is actually a way to look at it, right? But what this midrash is alluding to is something else, that the stories are not to be looked at as a timeline, but as a cycle. In other words, if we just talk about Sefer Shmot as an example, Sefer Shmot is like a recapitulation of Sefer Bereshit. It's not something new. It's the same story told, in a sense, on a different platform. So let me give you an example. Maybe some of you heard this example from me. Just to take a quick overview, right? Sefer Shmot begins with Bnei Yisrael paru vayishritzu vayirbu ma'od ma'od. Okay? I'm going to stop my share right now. Okay, Bnei Yisrael paru vayishritzu vayirbu ma'od ma'od. And that's, of course, reminiscent of Adam HaRishon of Puravu. And then we have Moshe Rabbeinu being saved in the Teva, and the description of the Teva, of the ark in which Moshe Rabbeinu is saved from the water, is the same description of the ark of Noach. So we have the story of Puravu, we have the story of Noach, and then we have the story of Bnei Yisrael as slaves making the bricks for Paro. And the description of those bricks is the same as Migdal Bavel. So we have Puravu, the Mabul, and Migdal Bavel in the beginning of Shmot. And of course, after Migdal Bavel in Sefer Bereshit, what's the next thing that happens? The next thing that happens is the story of the Avot. Right? If you would say, what's the story of the beginning of Bereshit? You have the creation of man, you have the Mabul, you have Migdal Bavel, and then you get into the Avot, right? And what do you have after the Bnei Yisrael making the Levanim? Parshas Va'era, El, Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, right? And just to top it off, the end of Sefer Shmot is the end of Sefer Bereshit is the Atzmot Yosef in the Aron in Mitzrayim, and the end of Sefer Shmot is Shnei Luchot HaBrit in the Aron in the Mishkan. And there's a parallel between Atzmot Yosef and Shnei Luchot HaBrit, okay? Because Yosef, Atzmot Yosef, were next to Shnei Luchot HaBrit in the Mishkan when Moshe Rabbeinu took them to Eretz Yisrael, right? So that's just, if you need convincing, you can see how Sefer Shmot doesn't just follow Sefer Bereshit, but it's parallel in a certain way to Sefer Bereshit, where what happens in Sefer Bereshit happens on the sort of the individual plane. You have the story of individuals, the story of the Avot. And in Sefer Shmot, you have the same story, but the stage now is history. Sefer Bereshit is not history in that sense. Sefer Shmot is history. I'm talking about history in terms of the stage is national, is cosmic, what's going on here, right? So this is a totally different way of looking at the stories, right? I just want the next quote, right? I just want to share with you. I'm going to share my screen again. Okay, if you see this, where it says, what will not be repeated is horrifying me. Okay? That was a quote by someone named Moshe Eliade, who was the founder of comparative religion. He wasn't Jewish. And he wrote a book called The Myth of the Eternal Return, where he develops this idea that in the ancient world, people viewed time not as linear, but as secular, right? So the cycle of things return. And he thinks that this fulfills a very strong psychological need, that something, if I look at time as something which one point follows the next point, and it will never return, there's something very horrifying about that. That means every passage of time is you could say, is a mini death, because it's never coming back, right? Normally we don't walk around thinking like this. It would make us very depressed, right? But the time slips away and it never comes back. But what looking at time as a cycle does, it sort of protects us from that. We say things always return. And in a sense, in the extreme expression, is that there's never anything new. I'm always reliving what came before. Does it make sense to anybody? I just need to know. You can nod your heads or raise your hands. Or like, does this sound very strange? I mean, it could sound strange and make sense, but everybody with me? I just need some feedback. Nod your heads or say no. Go like this if it's no. I just need to know. No, you don't get it? Okay, let me try to bring it out. Okay. Very often, let's talk about like personal relationships that we have. We enter into certain patterns with people, and we very often get into the same space that we were before, even though the conversation might be a different conversation and the issue might be another issue. But then you stop yourself and say, like, I'm in this place again. Sometimes l'tov, sometimes l'ra, right? But we have certain patterns of behavior as individuals, right? Does that make sense? You with me on that? Okay, so just take that idea and look at all of time that way. So where, if you have, and think of the story of Sefer Bereshit and Sefer Shemot, right? You have the same story in a sense, but it's not the same story, but it's coming around again. It's like, maybe the best mashal, it's like in a symphony, there's the melody that the composer develops, right? So if it's I don't know, if it's a violin concerto, so the violin will be the solo, or if it's a cello, the cello will be the solo. But then the entire symphony comes in and it plays the melody as the symphony, and not as the solo instrument, right? So in a sense, it's the same melody, but it's a totally different experience, whether it's the solo or it's the entire symphony. Yeah? Does that make sense? I'm just trying to find different areas where some of us might have experienced these things. So in a sense, then, that Sefer Bereshit is like the solo. Look at Sefer Bereshit as the violin, right? It's one instrument. It's just Avram, it's just Yitzchak, it's just Yaakov, right? And in Sefer Shemot, it's the entire orchestra coming in and playing the same thing, but it's the orchestra this time. So it's not Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, it's Bnei Yisrael. It's not Adam HaRishon that's Pru-Revu, it's Bnei Yisrael that are Pru-Revu. So it's the same melody, but the stage is different, the instruments are different. Does that make sense now? Did I clarify that a little bit? Yeah?
Yeah.
Now you'll see why I'm harping on this, right? So this is what Eliade was keenly aware of, and he wrote a book which I very strongly recommend called The Myth of the Eternal Return. And it fulfills a very important psychological need. It gives us a sense of meaning, because if time passes and never returns, what's the meaning of it? Right? But if I'm reliving, like if on Leila Seder, it's not a new experience. I'm reliving Yetziat Mitzrayim. That's what that is. So I'm reliving by eating the matzah, by eating the maror. I'm actually reliving the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. It's not I'm telling the story of something that happened a long time ago, but it's as if I'm transported back to that moment. And that's why it has meaning, is I'm coming out of Mitzrayim now, right? And that's what Eliade was aware of when he wrote, "What will not be repeated is horrifying me." It's something that happens once and then leaves is death. It's a form of death. And the meaning is found in that it always comes back, okay? So we have this. He was writing about ancient religions, but it's also, he thought that you don't have this in the Torah, but we have this in the Torah, and this is what we see here, okay? So that's all by way of an introduction. Okay, so let's now look at, I want to read some psukim from the beginning of Shmot, and then we'll get to Bo. Okay, Vayomer Hashem el Moshe ve'el Aaron lemor. I'll share my screen again. Hold on. Okay, here I'm reading Shmot Perek Zayin. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe ve'el Aaron lemor ki yedaber lechem Paro lemor du lachem mofet v'amart el Aaron kach et matcha v'ashlech lifnei Paro yehi letanim v'yavo Moshe v'Aaron el Paro v'yasu ken kasher tziva Hashem v'yashlech Aaron et mateu lifnei Paro v'lifnei abadav v'yehi letanim v'yikra gam Paro lechachamim lamechashvim v'yasu gam heim chartumei Mitzrayim v'latehem ken v'yishlichu ish mateu v'yu letaninim v'yivla matei Aaron et matotam. So we have a story in Perek Zayin of a serpent. Aaron has a serpent. Paro has a serpent. Okay, let's just continue for a moment. The next from Shmot Perek Dalet. Vayomer. This is when God gives the maket to Moshe. Vayomer hashlicheu arza. Vayashlicheu arza. Vayhi lenachash. Vayanos Moshe mipanav. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, shlach yadcha ve'echoz biznavo, vayishlach yado v'yachazek bo, v'yiyeh lemate bekapo. So here we have, this is the beginning of where we see that Moshe is something that Moshe seems to be afraid of, right? Vayanos Moshe mipanav. I mean, we would all be afraid of a snake, but why is the Torah telling us this? Why is it telling us that when, I'm sure Moshe had a lot of feelings and a lot of different things that happened, but the Torah doesn't often tell us how he feels, because the Torah isn't that type of book, right? It's not a novel where we're going to like drill down into the feelings of the characters. So it must be very significant to understand why Moshe is afraid of this Nachash. Okay. Now, this idea of a Nachash or a serpent, a Tanin, the Tanin, as we'll see in Sefer Yechezkel, let's take a look at the next source here. Daber v'amarta ko amar Hashem Elokim hineni alecha Paro melech Mitzrayim hatanim hagadol harovetz betoch yeorav asher amar li yeori vani asitini. So this is an attack on Paro, and Paro is referred to as the great serpent who dwells in the Nile. He's like a crocodile. Okay? So Paro is the serpent, and Moshe Rabbeinu, and this is where we're getting a different picture of Moshe, even before we get to the Zohar. Right? But just from reading the Psukim carefully, we're getting a picture of Moshe as not someone who is fearlessly standing up to Paro and demanding the release of Bnei Israel, but rather someone who is experiencing fear and anxiety in this situation, right? Because Vayonas mipanav, and Paro is the great serpent, and Moshe Rabbeinu is afraid of the serpent. Okay, now that's the first thing that I want to call everyone's attention to. The next thing is that, as per my introduction, what does this remind us of from Sefer Bereshit? The Nachash, of course, goes back to the story of the Nachash, and that casts Moshe as Adam Arishon. See that? And Adam Arishon, in relationship to the Nachash, has what to be afraid of. So what's happening here is, and this is where it's helpful to see or to use the story of Bereshit to explain the story of Shemot. So Moshe Rabbeinu is also, in a sense, like the only man. He's the center of the story here. So he's like Adam Arishon, and he's challenged by something that we don't know what yet, but is analogous to the threat that Adam Arishon felt. To Adam Arishon's relationship with the Nachash, and the Nachash's relationship with Adam Arishon and with Chava, somehow that gets carried over into the story of Sefer Shemot, where Paro is the one who plays the Nachash, and Moshe Rabbeinu is Adam Arishon. You see that? Okay. I mean, if you understand this, you can't ignore the fact that the story of the Nachash and the story of the Matan and Nachash goes back to Sefer Bereshit, and it's begging like some sort of explication. Okay. Now, I want to go to the Zohar. Okay. I'm going to share my screen again. Okay, so now we're up to the Zohar. I'm Rabbi Shimon. Hashta itla gala razin. Now is the time to reveal secrets. Okay? Maktiv, I skipped a little bit. See, it says Maktiv Bo Paro. What does it say in the beginning of the parsha? Bo el Paro. Lech el Paro mi bayale. But it should have said, if you think about it, Lech el Paro is God, so to speak, is with Moshe. They're not in Paro's presence. Paro is in the palace, presumably, and God and Moshe are someplace else. And God sends Moshe to Paro, right? So he should have said Lech el Paro. I mean, the Torah knows how to say Lech, Lech lecha, right? Lech. So what's Bo el Paro? My Bo. Why does it say Bo? So this is a very sensitive reading. Adrin batar adrin. God took Moshe from one room into the next room. Adrin batar adrin is chadarim acharei chadarim. That would be the Hebrew translation. Legabe hanina chad ilah takifa. To be in the presence of the one serpent who is terrifying, right? Legabe tanina chad ilah takifa, right? Legabe hatanina hamiyuchad ha'elyon hatakif, right? Dekama dargin mishtal sheleminei. because you could say all the evil comes from there. Uman ihu ze de tanina gadol. That's the great serpent. Umoshe dachil minei. And Moshe Rabbeinu is terrified of him. Dachil means to be terrified. Okay? So the Zohar, so this is what happens. God says boil paro. Why does he have to say boil paro? Because Paro is the serpent. Paro is the nachash. He's the nachash hakadmon. He's the primordial nachash. Here, I'll show you something interesting. Here, you see the pictures? Right? You see Paro's crown on the right? See that? What's that? What is that?
Serpent.
That's a serpent, right? Paro is symbolized by a serpent. I don't know if this is from King Tut or what this is, but this is a pharaonic mask, and you see that there's a serpent on top, right? So sometimes an argument has the additional virtue of being true, right? So historically, he's a serpent. But he's called the Tanin HaGadol. So the Zohar says that Moshe Rabbeinu, we still don't know why, but Moshe Rabbeinu was terrified by Paro, by the serpent. So God can't tell him, go to Paro. God says to him, come to Paro. What does that mean, Boel Paro? It's as if God puts his arm around Moshe's shoulders, says, come, we'll go to Paro together. Don't worry, I'll be with you. We'll go to Paro together. Boel Paro, come with me to Paro, right? Because Moshe Rabbeinu is terrified by himself. Okay? Now, we still don't know what this is about, okay? And I'm going to give a theory. We'll try to flesh this out. But until now, what we see is that by putting the story of Sefer Shemot on top of the story of Sefer Bereshit, so that the elements in Sefer Bereshit get acted out in Sefer Shemot, we can begin to understand the story in Sefer Shemot better. Because now I see something I wouldn't have seen before. Namely, that Moshe, just like when I don't know, sometimes I have this experience, and maybe you share it. Sometimes, especially in our parenting, we find ourselves being our own parents. Like, that's exactly what my father used to say to me. Like, you catch yourself, right? And sometimes you say, I swore that I would never do that to my kids. And here I am, I have become my parent, right? So I'm using this because this is really how our personal experience works. So Moshe Rabbeinu, in a sense, is finding himself, here I am, Adam Arishon, right? So Sefer Shemot is like we're in something new, but it's really happening again, right? Now, we don't know what that's about, but you do see the elements of the story of Bereshit in the story of Shemot, and that Moshe Rabbeinu is playing the role of Adam Arishon, and the snake, the serpent, the temptation, is played by Paro. And Moshe Rabbeinu, maybe because he knows the story of Adam Arishon, is terrified of this. So God, maybe because he also knows the story of Adam Arishon, and saw what happens when you leave Adam Arishon alone, or when you leave Chava alone. Here it's both of them together, right? Maybe they don't do so well with the Nachash. So maybe this time we have to fix things and make sure that the way it happens in Sefer Bereshit. So God says, don't worry, I'll come with you. Maybe I wasn't such a good parent the first time and I let them out on their own, and then there was a disaster. So now I'm going to come with you to Paro. I'll come with you to the night. Okay? It allows this type of reading. I'm not saying what I'm saying is pshat in terms of that's what happened exactly, right? But it allows our imaginations to fuse the two stories together and what we might learn from them. Okay. Okay. Now let's look at the Sfat Emet, okay? Because the those that are quickest to make these type of connections, these circular connections are the Hasidic interpretations of the Torah. Okay, they were aware of this. Okay, so let's see. This is the Sfat Emet. I'll share my screen again. Okay, hold on. Okay, here's the Sfat Emet. Okay, so it says here, Be'inyan hamateh yehi letanin. Ubamidrash shehukshu hamalchut linachash. There's a government or sovereignty or monarchy, whatever you want to say, malchut, authority, right, is like the nachash. Okay. Ube Parashat Shemot, hashlichehu arza, right? He connects the mateh and the tanin to the Moshe Rabbeinu getting the mateh from God, right? Vayanos Moshe, and Moshe was afraid. Achos biznavo, etc. Ha'inyanhu. Okay, now he's going to explain this. Okay, ha'inyanhu ki hagalut ba levarer hata'arovot tov v'ra shenaaseh al yidei hachet me'etz hadat tov v'ra. Okay, listen what he's doing here. He's going right back to Sefer Bereshit. He says, what is the galut about? The galut is galut Mitzrayim, right? Because that's where we are in Sefer Shemot. He says, so why do we have the galut? The galut, in a certain sense, is supposed to repair the chait of eating from the Eitz Hadat Tov V'Ra. Okay? Because what happened in the Eitz Hadat Tov V'Ra, good and evil became confused. That's the Tov V'Ra. It's not only the tree of good and evil, but what happened by eating the tree from the tree of good and evil, that good and evil became confused. And that means that we can see things which are good and think that they're evil, and we can see things that are evil which we mistake for being good. There's a confusion according to this reading of the chait. There are many different readings of what the significance of the chait of eating from the Eitz Hadat Tov V'Ra was, but this is the Hasidic reading. This is not unique to Sfat Emet. That the Eitz Hadat Tov V'Ra means now we live in a world where good and evil are confused, right? And the purpose of galut is to try to distinguish once more from good and evil, to get a clear view of what is good and what is bad, right? So I'll read it again. Ha'inyanhu, these are very important ideas in general, right? Ki hagalut ba levarer hata'arovot tov v'ra. Galut comes, suffering comes, right? In order to clarify, levarer, in order to clarify the confusion, ta'arovot, tov v'ra, the confusion of good and evil that happened because of the chait of Eitz Hadat, tov v'ra. Okay, now let's continue. The Katav, as it says, Vayigaresh, right? Et Adam mi Gan Eden, right? And on derech of Gan Eden, so that Adam HaRishon shouldn't be able to return to Gan Eden, there was the La Tacherev HaMitapechet, right? The flaming, double-edged sword, right? That's the story in Sefer Bereshit. Now, how does this story tell itself in Sefer Shemot? Let's take a look. V'hu atzmo inyan hipuch hanachash lemateh umateh lenachash. This is fascinating. The mateh switches back and forth, right? It goes from a wooden staff to a serpent, and then from a serpent back to a wooden staff. That is analogous to the la tacherev hamitapechet. The cherev hamitapechet means, the way he's reading it, Mitapechet doesn't mean double-edged. Mitapechet means changing, right? It's changing. The sword is changing. Think of it as like I don't know, maybe like the spokes of a wheel that are turning. So you can maybe see through the other side, but you can't get through the other side. So the nachash and the mateh, the nachash are this changing, constantly changing reality, right? Which is somehow a challenge. It doesn't let us get back to Eitz HaChayim, right? Because it has to be shomer derech Eitz HaChayim. Hold on one second. I just want to know if you guys are with me. Yeah? Okay. If you could, again, I ask that you should open your cameras, because I'd like to see you. And let me know that, are you following me?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. It's nice to see your faces also. Okay. So this the changing of the nachash to the mateh and the mateh to the nachash is somehow, and we don't know yet, I'm putting out more questions at this point, is somehow a reenactment of what we have in the story of Bereshit, of the la tacher hamitapechet, which prevents Adam HaRishon from going back to Gan Eden. Okay? So the truth is, after you see this Sfat Emet, he's obviously right. I mean, there's obviously echoes of the story of Bereshit and the Eitz HaChayim. Now that we begin to think this way, the mateh is wood, right? The mateh is the Eitz, is the Eitz HaChayim. And then you have the serpent. So the Eitz HaChayim is replaced by the serpent. So now we no longer have the Eitz HaChayim. But then it goes back to the Eitz HaChayim. It goes back and forth. Do you see that? And this is a very, let's continue on this Sfat Emet. I'll elaborate a little more. Do you guys want me to share my screen, or you all have your the sources?
Please share. Please
okay,
share.
I'll share. I will share. Okay. Okay. So he says, "V'hu atzmo inyan hipuch hanachash lemateh umateh lenachash." That's the third line. Okay. He ritzono yitbarach shemo, because God's will is haya liot dveikut ha'adam be'etz ha'chayim. A person, the original intent, if there wasn't the chait of eating from the Eitz Hadat Tov Ra, then human beings would have been able to eat from the Eitz HaChayim, right? Then there would have been connection to the Eitz HaChayim. But, right, Derech HaTorah, because the Eitz HaChayim is a symbol for the Torah. Eitz Chaim Hila Machazikim Ba, right? Okay, the Eitz HaChayim is a symbol for the Torah. So the goal of human beings is to be davek, is to cleave to God through the Torah. But that's the translation of that story for us. So Adam HaRishon, but he was chote, so now that way of cleaving to God is blocked. And it's blocked by the nachash and the la tacher of hamitapechet. And we'll see what that means. Okay? But Ritzono Yitbarach Shemo liot dveikut ha'adam be'etz ha'chayim derech ha'torah ha'hanhaga ha'pnimit. That means the inner reality. There's external appearances, which you'll see is symbolized by the nachash, and there's the reality. The Eitz HaChayim is the internal reality. Now take a look at the story of Bereshit and think of it as all happening inside of us. And think of the Eitz HaChayim as like your feeling of your quote unquote true self. But sometimes we can't get to our true selves because there's all sorts of things obscuring, and we have all sorts of machsomim, so all sorts of obstacles that block the way to ourselves. But we have all these desires that we have. There are things that that we can't do without. We have these mini addictions that we must have, right? And they get in the way. We try to dive in, but there's always other things come to our minds. That's all as a consequence of the tarovet of tova ra. We want good things, but there's also things that stand in the way, and that's the lat hacher v'mitapechet, right? So, but the inside, right? That's the part that wants to be davek, but we have problems with it, right? V'lulei achet, okay. Now I'm continuing Sfat Emet. Lo haya kol hateva ma'akevet ha'adam. If it wasn't for the chet, then human beings would not have to be in battle with their other nature, right? Because again, when I dive in and I can get a high point that I feel like I'm connected for a moment, but then I think about something. That itself, the Baal Shem Tov says, that's the lat hacher v'mitapechet. That exactly is like that disruption of your consciousness at the moment when you might have grasped something. That is the consequence of the chet, right? So if it wasn't for the chet, then people would naturally be able to connect themselves to God. Moshe katuv, ani amarti Elohim atem, right? In Sefer, in Tehillim, right? So we are divine, and this is actually, I think, the point. But I'm going to come back to this later. Al yedei hachet be'etz hadat, haya ha'onesh shelo yuchal karev el etz hachayim ad shitakein ze haderech hateva. So now we can't go directly to the etz hachayim. We were expelled from Gan Eden. We became, the way he's reading it, we became alienated from ourselves, right? So we can't have dveikut. So how do we get back? We can't like just go around ourselves. We have to work through ourselves, right? If you're psychologically oriented, then you could say you need to do therapy. If you're talking the way he would be thinking, you have to work in Torah mitzvot and Maasim Tovim. You have to make yourself into a better person. You have to draw distinctions between what's good and what's bad, and stick to the good and set aside the bad, right? Because you come into a world where that's all confused. So our work is to unconfuse it, right? So if you go through that, that's l'takein derech hateva, in order to get to the dveikut. And that happens in galut, because it happens in our alienation, in our separation from God. That's where we can do our work. Yeah? Everybody with me on this? You got to say it, because I'm only looking at the sources now. Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay. The Az. Oh, okay, one second. Mikan. Oh, this is really interesting. Mikan derech eretz kadma Torah. So now we have a new reading of the famous line, derech eretz kadma Torah. So everybody understands that, and it's also true that before the Torah, you have to be a mensch. That's derech eretz kadma Torah. A person could be like really, we have too many examples that the people are not menschim, right? They can be convicted of all sorts of crimes, and people think that's tzaddikim. Right?
They become ministers.
And they become ministers, right? Or there's an attempt for people to become ministers, right? And it's a chil Hashem that the chilonim have to be the ones to stop it, because derech eretz kadma Torah, right? So that's one way of reading this. But he's saying something else. Before you get to dveikut, you have to go through the world, which of course does mean honesty and all those things. But it means there's a religious quest to distinguish between good and evil. And that comes before the Eitz HaChayim of the Torah. Uperashnu ki ze na'aseh achar hachet. And that's the reality after the chet. V'lachein huchrechu b'nei Yisrael liot b'Mitzrayim kodem shezachu lekabel haTorah v'hu letakein derech hateva. Is the work that they had to do in Mitzrayim, the labor, the physical labor, is an analogy and maybe even parallel to spiritual labor that has to happen. Because when you're in an extreme situation, you understand what's really important and what's less important. You understand what's good and what's evil, to experience that. And that's why that's Derech Eretz is the Galut, Kadma Torah, before Mamad Har Sinai. Okay. Ubekoch Ish Yisrael Batel Teva. And we have the possibility, right, to get past nature, to find nature being the world of good and evil. We can work through that, and then we can be Davek in a Kadosh Baruch Hu, which is L'mala min Ateva. Okay? Va'az na'aseh, now he goes back to how do we read this in the story of Shmot. Va'az na'aseh mi nachash mateh. The nachash is this world, is the world of Tova Ra. But we can get past that and go to Eitz HaChaim, which is the mateh, which is the wooden staff. Okay? So we'll stop here in the Sfat Emet. So what we have here is he's drawing a parallel between Gan Eden, the dvekut with God, the chet, and the need to repair the chet through spiritual work in the world is very Hasidic, right? But it's also, it's actually not only Hasidic, it's actually a very Jewish ethos to work in the world. Right? We don't try to escape the world, right? Monks, I'm not saying this to put down Christianity. It's just the way the Gadol Christianity looked at the world is that the world you have to escape from the world, right? And there are elements of that in Judaism also, okay? But the primary ethos of Judaism, I'm talking in real generalities here, but I think it's justified. You can talk about the ethos of the Torah is not to escape from the world, but actually to embrace the world and work through the world. And that's what he's describing here. And so you're working in the world of the Nachash, of Tova Ra. And when you get past it, then the Nachash turns into a Mateh. Okay? Now, but the Mateh also turns back into a Nachash. It goes back and forth. And that is the Cherev HaMitapechet. Because had it not been for the Chet, the way he's describing it, is that our consciousness would always be in a state of Dveikut with God, in a certain type of awareness of God. And after the Chet, there may be moments where we achieve that, but they're only moments, and then they're lost again. And then we have to go back to work, and then we might find it again. Like, it might be only rare cases in your life where you have an experience like that. Right? Everybody is different and experiences things in different ways, but we all experience this, what's called Ratzov Ashov, is going back and forth. So what he's saying,
Excuse me, but the best you can do is this halach v'shav. You can never get back into Gan Eden.
Right, not the way things are now. Right. So there's a striving, like the you can say the messianic vision here is not a national messianic vision. The Mashiach for the individual is where you could actually get past this, right? But let's set that aside because that's not where we are, right? The best place that we could possibly be is what's described in Bereshit and also in Shmot, right? Is this moving back and forth after the Chet, where there's a moment of revelation and feeling of oneness with God, which is then disrupted by the world. And then we go back to, feeling far away from God. And then we go back to work and then we feel closer to God. So that in Sefer Bereshit, that is the consciousness of Adam Harishon after the Chet. He lives in the world of the Lat HaCherev HaMitapechet, right? Where his consciousness is moving back and forth. It's in upheaval because of the Chet. And we're all going back and forth all the time. And that is symbolized in Sefer Shmot by the mateh turning into a nachash, and the nachash turning into a mateh. That's the la tacherev hamitapechet. And, okay, you see that? So you see how much we get by seeing Sefer Shemot as an expression of Sefer Bereshit? Okay? And Moshe Rabbeinu, for some reason, which we don't know yet, is afraid of this, right? Moshe Rabbeinu is not the brave character. He's actually afraid of Paro, the way Adam HaRishon is afraid of the Nachash. Okay, that's where we are. We have this consciousness which is totally, in disarray, going from one place to another, between hope and anguish, between closeness and alienation, right? And we have Moshe Rabbeinu in a state of terror to the extent that God has to come with him, right, to Paro. Good? Okay, now what I want to understand is the last point, is what is Moshe Rabbeinu afraid of? Okay, so for this, I want to take a look at the last source, and that is the Pri Tzadik from Parashat Bo. I'll share my screen again. Okay, now we're on the last source. Okay, so he says, Sarich lahavin. Heichan matzinu dedachil minei Moshe. He's quoted the Zohar. And he says, where do we see, like the Zohar is in Parashat Bo, so where do we see that Moshe was afraid of Paro, right? So he says, that Paro represents what he calls the klipa raza de tanina gadol, arich de klipa. Okay, these are Kabbalistic concepts. What he's saying is that the great serpent is the Yetzer Hara. We'll see why this is. V'hainu hayetzer hara mereshit de klipa. I'm just going to read the sentence and I'll explain it. V'hu eino mesit l'ra meforash. Rak hu mitchapes kimore derech litova. He says that what characterizes the great serpent, in this case Paro, or what characterizes the Nachash, when he talks about the Reshit HaKlipa, because the beginning, like the kernel of evil, where evil comes from, where evil is so deeply hidden, before evil is revealed, it's hidden. And there are things that are evil that we recognize very clearly as evil, and we don't have a problem in labeling it as evil and fighting it, right? That, in a sense, is the mitzvah of Amalek, that when you see evil, there are a lot of problems with the mitzvah of Amalek, and I'm not talking about that, but the value that you can extract from there is that when things are clearly evil, we have to fight it in an uncompromising way. That's what I learned from Amalek. But there's also evil which is hidden. And it comes out as propaganda. It comes out as the Nachash doesn't instigate explicit evil. He impersonates, he puts on a disguise as if he's telling you something good. The Sitra Achra, Samael, right? It's the devil, right? Saroshel Esav. The Ita Kitalmid Chacham Nidmelo says the Yetzer Hara comes to a person in the form of a Talmid Chacham. Neged Yaakov Avinu alav hashalom, that he disguises himself, right? Kirav Mored Derech Litova. This is where life is confusing. This is where Tova Ra is confusing. because the Ra is disguised as Tov. So we don't know what's true, right? Vahu, the evil, Sam Choshech Leor. He takes darkness and he says, this is light. Va'omer La Ra Tov. And he says, this evil is good. Vahu Shoresh Hanachash. And that is the serpent. Why? Shebemetu kolel kol haklipot. What's a klipa? A klipa is an outer shell, right? In other words, it covers the reality. It gives the exact opposite impression of what's true. Okay? Sha'af, let me continue with this. Sha'af hatchalat hasatat nachash. And that's actually what the nachash represents to Adam and Chava. And let's see how he says this. Umatzinu she'amar, the nachash said to Adam Arishon, or to Chava, lo mot tumutun. He says, you won't die, right? The echech ulomar kain. How could he say that? Kevan shemar Hashem yitbarach b'feirush ki biyom ha'chocham imenu mot tamut. So how does the nachash lie, right? So he's trying to say the nachash is more sophisticated than that. It wasn't b'feirush. They're saying God is wrong. That nobody would buy that, right? Ach mitchila hichnis b'leiv Chava. The nachash is very subtle, right? He injects doubt into Chava's heart. Sheshinta v'amra pen tumutun, v'achar kach amar la lomo tumutun. So it goes from pen tumutun, like maybe you'll die, lest you die, and then it says no, you won't die. Dahainu, okay, so but still, how does that work? The emet sheda'ag Hashem yitbarach l'tovatchem. So this is what the nachash is saying. God told you not to eat from the Eitz Hadat Tov Ra. Why did he tell you that? Because it's dangerous for you. He's worried about you. God cares about you. God loves you, right? So he's telling you, don't eat from the Eitz Hadat Tov Ra. Sheda'ag Hashem yitbarach l'tovatchem. This is the nachash speaking. Va'amar shelo tachlu me'Eitz Hadat Tov Ra, pen tit'amu mitzad hara upen tumutun. Because the Eitz Hadat Tov Ra has Tov and Ra in it, right? This is all symbolic, right? It's not just about fruit and rotten fruit, right? That there's Tov and Ra here. In other words, life has good and evil in it. So God is telling you, don't eat, don't get involved in life. There's good there, but there's also evil there. So we want to be careful. This is true. There are situations which for us, everyone is in situations like this at different times, where we deem a situation too hazardous to enter. Now, there might be some redeeming reason to try, if it's to salvage a relationship or whatever it is, right? There might be some redeeming reason to get into it, but it's also dangerous. So what do? So we can determine that the danger is too great and we have to just give up on the potential because the danger is too great. So this is what God loves you and he cares about you. So he's telling you, maybe you'll die. So don't do it. Pen tumutun, right? And then I'm telling you, look, lomo tumutun. No, you can meet the challenge and you can just do the tov. I knew the emet, the this is still the nachash speaking. But God really wants, what does God really want? He wants you, yes, to eat from the fruit. So look, and this is true in life. The people who grow are the people who take risks and challenges. The people who are always afraid of getting something wrong, they won't get anything wrong in their lives, but they won't be very interesting people, right? And they won't really grow. So the truth is, and I'm saying this not as the nachash, the truth is every situation is different and we have to decide, like what type of issues are we entering into on where you're going to take a chance we can do something good, do something good for the world and grow ourselves from it. And what situation to say, yeah, maybe I'm just fooling myself and I think that I'm doing something good for the world, but it's really about me. You know, someone could say that a prime minister is, you know, he can endanger the country, but he really thinks it's best for the country, but it's really just about himself. I'm talking about some other country, someplace far away, right? So, so this is where the hasatav the nachash comes in. So he's saying God wants you to eat from the tree, and the truth is sometimes He does. This is where the nachash. It's really hard to deal with the nachash. And then you'll be like God. Oh, this is good. Right? Don't worry. It's like he's not denying what God said. God is saying you might die. I'm telling you, no, don't worry. You won't die. Yodea Elohim. Right? So the nachash represents a really complex reality where we have to engage in the world, which is tova ra, in order to extract whatever tov we can and deal with the ra. But sometimes you can't take a chance. And this is where the nachash is sort of misleading Chava and Adam. Right? Now, the nachash, this idea of sam tov v'ra l'tov, where the nachash is all about representations and impressions or misimpressions, it goes back to the symbolism of a nachash. A nachash, in the ancient world, by the way, I'm sure you're aware of this, the symbol for medicine is a serpent, right? It's the modern symbol also. It's a serpent on a staff. And that's taken most immediately from the Torah, the story of the Nachash and Nechoshet that stops the Magefa, right? You're familiar with that, right? But it predates. The picture on the left here that you see in my shared screen is the Sumerian god of medicine. And it's also a Nachash. Now, why is a Nachash associated with medicine? For the same reason it's associated with the Chet. Because the Nachash has a really interesting characteristic, which had to be very powerful in the ancient world when people observed snakes. Snakes shed their skin, and they're constantly reborn. And that is medicine. That's why medicine is symbolized by a serpent. It's rebirth, it's regeneration. And that's why in the ancient world, the god of medicine, even before the Greeks, right? This is Mesopotamia, 2500 BC, is symbolized by a serpent. There's a serpent sheds its skin. So on the one hand, the positive side of that, which is less emphasized in, let's say, Jewish mythology, because we emphasize the evil side of the Nachash, but the positive side of the Nachash is regeneration. But the negative side is that it's all klipot. The Nachash is never what it seems. It's always shedding its skin, right? So it's all externalities. Right? He speaks with forked tongue, right? The Nachash doesn't speak the truth. It's sam l'ra tov et l'tov ra. It makes the good seem evil and the evil seem good because it's all appearances. Right? That's what the Nachash symbolizes. Now, people, okay, go back and forth, right? And that's the la tacher v'metapechet, and going from the Nachash to the Mateh, from the Mateh to the Nachash. There are moments of clarity, that's the Mateh. And then we live in the world of the Nachash, of appearances, and we're not sure what's real and what's not real. And we go back and forth, right? That's the la tacher v'metapechet, which is what Adam HaRishon experiences, what we all experience after the Chet, right? And it's what Moshe Rabbeinu experiences also. Now, let's get to, so what might Moshe Rabbeinu be afraid of? So here, it's really speculative. He's afraid of this challenge that Paro represents. Okay? Paro represents this world of appearances, which Moshe Rabbeinu is somehow afraid that he's going to be misled by Paro and get drawn in to Paro's world. The way Adam HaRishon took the bait, right, from Chava and Chava from the Nachash. So what about this world is what he's afraid of? Okay, so I think the key is what the Nachash tells Adam HaRishon, or tells Chava, Veyitem kelohim. You'll be like God. So how is that a temptation? What about that is tempting? And the truth is, in Sefer Bereshit, we have another 5 minutes, just think about this for a second. Where do you have this Veyitem kelohim happening again? When Rachel demands from Yaakov that he should pray for her, what does he say? Hatachat Elohim ani, Hashem mana mimech pri baten, right? I'm not instead of God, right? When Yosef hears the dreams of the Sar Mashkim and the Sar Ophim, what does he say to them? Le'Elohim pitronim. God has the interpretations. Hagidu na li, to tell me. So how is Yosef looking at himself? And this is the chait of Yosef in a certain sense, why he's in the bar, right? Because he's saying, I remember Lichtenstein put it this way, Le'Elohim pitronim, hagidu na li. Like, I'm God. God will give you the solution, so tell me. So this is the Vehitim Kelohim. It's the Hasatah of the Nachash. And at the end, Yosef learns the hard way. When the brothers bow down to him, he cries and he says, I'm not Elohim. Those are his words. Hatachat Elohim ani. He says it again. But here, he went back to Yaakov and he understood that what maybe Rachel didn't understand. Rachel is relating to Yaakov as a God. And Yaakov is saying, I'm not God. Right? And here Yosef is saying, I'm not God. So and that actually, the end of Sefer Bereshit, the very back to the beginning of Sefer Bereshit. When Yosef says, Hatachat Elohim ani, he's answering the Nachash. When the Nachash says, Veyitem kelohim, in the end of Sefer Bereshit, the final realization is that we're not Elohim. And that's Yosef's response to the Nachash. And Moshe is afraid of that because what Paro represents, first of all, in the ancient world, the king is divine. But that's something that's like really hard for us to grasp. I think it should be hard to grasp the divinity of a leader, right? But I think if we want to try to understand it for ourselves, that power intoxicates and it creates an illusion that you're all powerful. And that's what the name Elohim represents. Elohim, translated into English, is the Almighty, right? So it's this feeling of power that Paro has. And Moshe Rabbeinu was afraid that when he sees that, and what's the Hasatah of the Nachash? The Hasatah of the Nachash is, you can be like God. In other words, you have all this power, so you can use it. It's like the Lord of the Rings, right? Where there's tremendous amount of power, and you think you're going to use it for good, right? I think that's what Gandalf said. I would use this for good. I'm just remembering this now, right? So you have this tremendous amount of power, and this is what Moshe Rabbeinu was afraid of. It's so different from the way we're used to reading it. But Moshe Rabbeinu was afraid of the power that the leadership is going to give him. And he's afraid he's going to fall into Paro's world where power becomes everything. So God has to say, and this is why God chooses Moshe. Moshe doesn't want this. He's afraid of this. And that's why he has to not want the job. That's the paradox. Moshe Rabbeinu seems to be like the worst choice because he doesn't want the job. If I hire somebody, the first thing I'm looking for is somebody who wants the job. If someone comes to me in an interview and say, I don't really want this job, but I'll find somebody else. I want somebody that wants to do the job, right? But here God has to find someone that doesn't want to do the job. Because if you want to do the job, you're going to fall into this power, this idolatry of power. And that is what Moshe Rabbeinu, I think, is afraid of. And I'm basing that simply on what the Nachash says, V'yitim kelohim, and what the word Elohim means, and actually how it plays itself out in Sefer Bereshit. And it's happening again in the beginning of Sefer Shmot, where Paro represents, I'm a God, come sit next to me. You grew up in my home, Moshe. You can be powerful and you can do amazing things. Stay here in Egypt with me and we can change the world together. Forget about these lowly slaves. I'm giving you an empire, right? He could have said all sorts of things to entice Moshe with power. And Moshe is actually afraid of that, right? So I think that's my reading of Moshe and what Moshe Rabbeinu was afraid of in Bo El Paro, that he's terrified of Paro and God has to go with him. And God's going with him reminds him of where the power lies and what his true role is as an instrument of God, not as being an independent power. And I'll just say it would be good if political leaders realize that. Okay, Shabbat Shalom.
Gosh, go ahead.
Okay, take care.